you're alive. Um, all right, so I counted it up. We're going to be in chapter 21 tonight. We won't finish it. It's going to be probably a little on the briefer side, which is fine. That doesn't happen to us too often. And then we'll conclude chapter 21 next week, and then we'll probably have 2 weeks for chapter 22. So that puts us at just 3 more weeks after tonight. But this is kind of like, like the moment we've all been waiting for, if you will. So we're going to be starting in chapter 21 tonight, and I think just going through the first 7 verses. But we're going to be looking at the new creation. So if you will recall, at the end of chapter 20, we did away with the enemy once and for all. We had that millennial kingdom, which we believe, most of us tend to hold the opinion that that's going to be a literal 1,000 years with a literal rule and reign of Jesus on the earth, the idea of which is to essentially establish an earthly kingdom, as was always the intention from the beginning, which got thwarted very early on when Adam and Eve sinned. So the millennial 1,000-year reign is essentially Jesus saying, let's try this the right way and see how it goes. And even at the end of trying it the right way, when Satan is released, he makes one final attempt to deceive the nations, succeeds in deceiving some, but then, of course, fire falls down from heaven and devours the armies of the enemy. And then God casts Satan along with the false prophet and the Antichrist into the lake of fire for forever. And that is closed up and sealed. And all of those folks, we talked about the great white throne judgment, which is the judgment for all of the non-believers, the same verdict handed out at that judgment for every person who shows up, which is a guilty verdict. And they are all dismissed from the goodness and glory of God. And then now we turn our attention to what's left for the rest of us. Hopefully, all of us. I think we're all in good company here. And this is now, we're fulfilling the purpose of the whole book. So we have read this purpose statement every single study that we have done through the book of Revelation. I was actually just looking back through. We're coming up on being in this for almost a year. We're only in like 32 sessions. We took a little bit of some breaks here and there, but it's almost been an entire year that we've been doing this on Wednesday nights, minus the breaks. So we've been coming to this. We've been reading this every single night that we gather together for this study, and now we're finally actually getting to the realization of it in the book. But John has written this book to remind God's suffering people of the victory of Jesus Christ over the power of sin. That is the purpose of the book of Revelation, is to acknowledge, yes, we have a formidable enemy. He's awful. He's terrible. Has some things going on in the earth right now which are really, really hard for us to stomach. But the reminder to everyone is that Jesus wins in the end. And that's basically the overarching purpose of why he wrote this book. So this section that we're going to be looking at tonight is an overview of the new creation. And when we close this out at the end, you're going to see exactly why it's called an overview of the new creation. I just only came across this as I was studying for this message. This very interesting sort of structural technique that John is using here, where he's essentially kind of summarizing the whole rest of the book. That's kind of a summary of chapters 21 and 22 in these opening verses. So we'll make it real clear before we finish out, but this is going to be an overview of the new creation tonight that John is showing us. And he says this, starting in chapter 21 in verse 1. He says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." And then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death." So, these 8 verses are an overview of the rest of the book. And we're going to see what that looks like as we go through. So what we're going to do here, we've modified our approach several times. We are going to continue. We're just only going to look at one perspective here, basically, which is that what we would call a literalist, kind of futurist, premillennial sort of understanding of this, which is to say that all of these things that John is saying are actually things that we should be looking for to take place actually. He's not speaking in symbols or figures anymore at this point. And there are people who kind of, argue about whether or not you should read the whole book of Revelation the same way. If you start off reading it and you're in one part and it's all a bunch of symbols and pictures and you have these various things that are standing in for other things, and even sometimes in the book John says this image here is this thing, and he explains its kind of earthly correspondence, then they say, well, if you're reading it symbolically like that at this part, then you should read it that way the whole time. And by and large, I do believe that that's true, but there's a real big distinction in what is happening here starting in chapter 21 and in chapter 22, and that is that the spiritual and the physical worlds are now completely overlaid without any veil between them. We talked about this on Sunday. If you were here, I talk about it from time to time on various days when we get together for study, but there's a spiritual world going on all around us right now. There's spiritual warfare taking place all around us right now. There are very likely spirits of various kinds in here right now with us. We've had people say that they have seen things in this very room before. And sure, of course, that makes sense. We believe that. We don't see those things right now because there is a barrier between our world and the spiritual world. But what we have taking place here in the return of Jesus is essentially that barrier is removed when we're moving into eternity. And John is seeing things no longer in metaphors or in representations of something that they should be, but as they actually will be when our two worlds collide, if you will. So there's reason to read these 2 chapters literally. And that's how I read them. There is always a multiplicity of meaning in the things that we see, and I think that's just one of the beauties of the mind of God, is that you guys are familiar with double entendre. When people use that, there's various, in music, it's really popular when you're talking about poetry and someone's written a poem about this beautiful tree with these blossoming flowers and whatever, and it's like, is this a story, a poem about a tree? Or is this like about your girlfriend? Because it kind of sounds like I don't really know. And it's like kind of both. It's this like double entendre. You see this all throughout the Bible, and I really think that that is something from the creative mind of God that he has given to human beings. And as such, I think that even in heaven, in eternity, I think that things have a great number of meanings and significance. The same thing like with the parables. We might have talked about this in here on a Wednesday night, that parables, when Jesus told parables, he took elements of the naturally created order of things, plants and, whatever, various people. Trying to think of some of the other parables. Seeds, thank you. Birds, all kinds of, right? The created order, he looks at those and draws a spiritual point from them, which, you have to go back and think like, well, when in the beginning, when God created this thing, he surely knew that he was going to use this to make a point about himself. So, like, all of the creation points to God. Everything that has been created points to God, has a greater meaning and significance, and I would think that it's even more so that way in heaven. That you see we'll get to some of it when we won't get there tonight, but we'll start into it next week. But suffice it to say, we can read this literally and still kind of look for a deeper symbolic message here. So we're just going to take this a few lines at a time, just some of the key lines from these 8 verses. And the first one, he says that the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And this fact was alluded to in the previous chapter, where John saw the throne of God, from whose face the earth and the heavens fled away, and there was found no place for them. If you remember that, that was Jesus is coming to judge. It says that the whole heavens and the earth flee from his presence. We marveled at what that might actually mean or look like. How does all of creation just depart from the presence of God? But somehow or another, whatever this is going to look like, it happens that heaven and earth entirely disappear. The earth that we're standing on right now and the universe out there, the heavens, they all disappear. If you've ever seen the movie or read the book, The Never-Ending Story, anybody that one? The Never-Ending Story. It's about this fairy tale land, this land of all of the creatures that are in stories and these magical beings and these heroes and everything. And then it's colliding with the modern culture of the time, which it's in I don't know when it was originally written, but the movie was made in the 80s, and kids are no longer reading books, and they're playing video games, and they're doing other things. So the land of all of the literature characters is disappearing. It's turning into nothing. The nothing is coming and devouring it, until at the end, it's just our hero is just flying through on his magical dragon through this empty void, because everything disappeared. And it's kind of like that's presumably the scene. I don't know where we'll all just be floating around maybe momentarily with Jesus. Don't know exactly how it goes, what the time in between the old heaven, this current earth, and heaven disappearing and the new one coming, but there's some kind of transition there. And that happened back in the previous chapter when God was judging the whole earth. And it seems that we move right from that, everything fleeing, to the judgment scene, the great white throne judgment. So it may just be everything dissolves, and now we're just left as spiritual entities in some kind of, who knows. Remember this moment, and when we're all standing there together, we can be like, this is what I was talking about. We know now. While this may be understood literally, as I have argued, it is also possible to apply it spiritually. So I believe that there's both going on here, an actual literal fulfillment of this and a spiritual one, since in connection with declaring the believer to be a new creation, Paul also says old things have passed away. So that's in 2 Corinthians 5. If anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And really, this is kind of this idea of the already not yet that we've talked about before, that you're in the Christian faith, there's this tension between things being already completed but not yet realized, which is like our salvation. Like we're already saved, we're already free from sin. But it's like, am I free from sin? Because I still struggle with sin all the time. But the Bible tells us that we're free from sin. But we're still like in this tension with sin. In the same way, the enemy has already been defeated. But it seems like he's alive and well still in the earth. So there's this already not yet sort of thing. And what we have here, what John is pointing to at the end of Revelation, is this is the moment when the not yet becomes now. That the idea of the already that we're living in is realized at the end of time. So all that this is pointing to actually comes to fulfillment. And we could say that in a spiritual sense, there is a fulfillment of this in the natural and in the spiritual as well. So the old things passing away, everything being made new, literally, with the heavens and the earth. And it may even refer to the old covenant system. Some people have suggested that is the case, which the author of Hebrews said was ready to vanish away. So the old covenant law has, disappeared and is done away with. And even, I guess, in some regard, the new law, the new covenant. And if you're familiar with your Old Testament and your New Testament, those are the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, that in some way, even the new covenant law that we are bound to now reaches this greater level of fulfillment, presumably, when, we're wed with Jesus, and that becomes the old one. Then we have two old covenants, and we live in the reality of the new and eternal one. So there could be a multiplicity of kind of meanings here, but I believe that you're very safe to assume that there's a literal meaning for this, that this earth and the heaven that exists wherever now are going to be replaced. And then this little line where he says, and there was no more sea. And this may be a literal fact of the new creation, which would mean, I have that there twice, the 3/4 of the earth's surface now covered with water will no longer be uninhabitable. Even with the absence of the oceans, there may be large bodies of fresh water for us to enjoy in the new heaven and the new earth. So this is always a striking sort of idea, this idea that the old heaven and the old earth had passed away and there was no more sea. Now, the difficulty with this, we'll explore this in a second, but let's lay out the whole problem here first. Alternatively, most people read that usually that there's going to be no sea in the new earth. Maybe lakes and things like that, but no sea. But alternatively, this phrase may be directly linked to the previous one. Not only had the former heaven and earth, that is the land, passed away, but the former sea as well. So it's not that this clause ought to be considered in connection with the one that precedes it. So it could read a little more like this. There's a new heaven and a new earth because the old heaven and the old earth, along with the sea, had passed away. That you could read it like that. That could be what's going on here. And if so, then a new heaven and earth replace the old, so also a new sea will replace the old one. But then there's, of course, the symbolic sort of meaning of sea, which by now we're all quite familiar with because we've seen it repeatedly over and over throughout the book of Revelation, which is every time John uses the sea as some kind of symbol, it's referring to the nations. And it could be a symbol representing the Gentile nations. And if that is so, then it is referring to the fact that only spiritual Israel remains in all the nations, of all the nations that once covered the planet. So all throughout Revelation, land represents Israel, the sea represents the Gentiles, and if John is saying there's no more sea, and if that had meant Gentiles all throughout the book, then what he's saying is there's no more foreigners. There's no more people that aren't the people of God, that everyone's the people of God. And it could somehow, be all three of these, actually. It could be that the old sea passes away with the old earth, and then when the new one comes, there is no sea, but we do have some fresh water and things like that. It's very, very interesting because if you ever do any studies in, anybody ever looked into like the pre-flood, the antediluvian world, we can't say with much certainty anything about it, but there are lots of scientific and even geological data points that we can look at that kind of point back to what the world might have looked like before a giant global flood. And one of those things is Pangea. You're familiar with Pangea. We all learned about Pangea. They have a naturalistic explanation of it where the continents, continental drift and plate tectonics and all of that, and eventually the continents all separated very slowly over millions and millions of years. And that somebody figured that out because they all fit back together. If you squished all the continents back together, they would interlock into one giant landmass. So, they would say millions of years of continental drift, and we would say a few days of a catastrophic worldwide flood, and it's separated the whole earth. So you have all of that coming back together, but what's really the point that I was trying to make, that wasn't where I was trying to go, is that the waters after the flood, when they receded, there's a wide range of people who, when they listen to that, when they hear the waters receding, they think that the waters didn't recede all the way back to where they were previously. And what is also very interesting is that in some places there is a site that is actually proposed as the lost city of Atlantis. And Atlantis gets this sort of mythological story about it because it's this city that's under the water, right? So there's a city that is built under the water. It's under like 50 feet of water, and there's just the ruins of a city down there, and it's like, why would you can't build a city down there? What's going on? Well, obviously, at one point, it was above sea level. So you either would have to say that some earthquake happened and the whole plate just dropped 50 feet down into the ocean, maybe, or the earth was flooded and the waters didn't recede all the way down to their original level before, so we've actually lost a lot of land mass. And that might be kind of what's being pointed to here with the new creation, is that the sea as we know it is not necessarily that it's no more, but it's not in the same way that we know it, and you have this huge landmass for people to live on. You have to consider, if you start thinking about all of the peoples, we'll get to this when we get to the dimensions of heaven, which is really, really fun. But if you were to speculate as to how many Christians, there might be, how many believers will there be in heaven for all of eternity, I mean, you're easily getting into the multiple billions and billions of people. Where are they all going to live? What's this going to be all about? And we'll talk about it. But it could be that the earth will have a lot more land than it currently does. Janice.
Up in North Carolina, there are actually towns that are underwater now where people used to live. And up around where I was living in Tennessee, too, they have, and I think it was because of flooding. Well, I know it was, because when they were putting dams in.
Watch your mouth in church, Janice.
Anyway.
Go ahead. Yes.
There's like 3 cities. All the people up there talk about these cities that are underwater.
Yeah. It can happen. It can be. Yep. I have not heard of those. I don't know how far under the water they are, but yeah, there are some that are very, very deep under there.
Tennessee Valley Authority, they're the ones that created these lakes and reservoirs, and there was towns.
Oh, yes, I've heard about this now. Yeah.
Those towns are now flooded, they've moved all the people out.
Yeah, that was more man-made sorts of dams and those sorts of things. Yeah, yep, I have heard of that.
To do the dams or, yeah.
Janice. I'm sorry. So that's kind of, it would be weird. It would be weird if God restored the earth and there was no ocean. Like, it'd be kind of strange. I don't know if that means that, like, then there's no ocean creatures. Of course, who knows if there's any animals at all, presumably. It's hard to say. But it's a weird thought that there would be no more sea. So it kind of, I like the reading there that's mentioned in that second paragraph, that it's just kind of in conjunction with the land disappearing, and also so did the sea, but the new earth is going to have some kind of, you would hope, some kind of, don't we all love to sit and watch the waves crash in and a nice sunset over the beach? And what's that? Yeah, I don't know. But I would think there's going to be an ocean in the new earth, but no telling. He says then, the holy city, New Jerusalem, he saw prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And we talked about this back in chapter 17. We looked forward to this chapter at that time. Now we're looking back to 17, where Babylon is pictured as a great harlot. And here now, the New Jerusalem is pictured as a chaste bride. The figure of a woman to represent a city goes back to the Old Testament, when Jerusalem is referred to as the virgin, the daughter of Zion. So this is a common sort of thing. I was thinking about it as I was putting these notes together, that anytime you personify any kind of non-personal item, like, a car, they're always girls, aren't they? Aren't cars always girls? Old girl, or any kinds of, even like, I don't know, trees, or I don't know what other things you would ascribe human qualities to, but it seems like it's always girls. Even like liberty, like Lady Liberty. Why is injustice, is blind, and justice is a woman, and wisdom in the Bible is portrayed as a woman. It's always women. Women always they don't want to, I guess guys just aren't cut out for it. But we have here, it's if you're going for the literal reading of this, right? If we're like saying we're reading this literally, well, what on earth does this mean? A city's coming down adorned like a bride? Like, what exactly does that mean, or does that look like? And it's kind of hard. You kind of really have to take this as kind of a symbol. But the symbol, of course, in the ancient world here, and also if you're unfamiliar with weddings in the ancient world, weddings in the ancient world were very unlike weddings today. Weddings today, the star of the day, the only one that anyone's even really there to see, is the bride in every single wedding. You go to a wedding today and it's all about the bride, and when you're planning the wedding, it's just whatever the bride wants, and the groom and all the dudes are usually just standing there, like, without any mention before the whole thing even starts. And he's really just there so that she has somebody to walk down to. And then the music and the flower girl and the whole thing, and like, it's all about the woman. Not so in the ancient world. In the ancient world, it was all about the man. It was about this new young man who was becoming an adult, establishing a new family. We had a new figurehead in our community, and he was, of course, bringing his bride along with him. But the center of attention was the man. And when you put this into the terms of the wedding that we see at the end of time with Jesus, the bridegroom, and his bride, it makes a lot more sense that all the attention at this great marriage supper of the Lamb is going to be on the bridegroom, on Jesus, not on us. And that's kind of the way that it had always been throughout most of history, really, up until just recently here. So Anybody? No candidates for marriage here except Allison. Hi, Allison. You could do it the right way, when you get married. You could just sheepishly just walk in and have on just like a smock or something.
It lasts like days.
Yes, and they lasted days, usually somewhere in the neighborhood of a week or so of celebrating. Yes, yeah, big old to-dos were they. And that actually, some people think that if you have this, idea of the rapture and all of that, and if we do get called up to heaven before all of these things happen, that the marriage supper of the Lamb is taking place during those 7 years, that the earth is kind of, going to hell, as it were, that we're up there partying with Jesus. That's an idea. That is definitely a thought that some people have had. But anyhow, there's a picture there. So Babylon portrayed as a harlot, and then, of course, the New Jerusalem portrayed as this pure virgin bride coming for the bridegroom. And since the New Jerusalem is later described as the Lamb's wife, we can readily identify the symbol with the church, which is the bride of Christ. We'll see that in Ephesians chapter 5. Won't be too long before we're there on Sunday mornings. That's going to be fun. Going to be a good series. We're going to do like a series within a series when we get to chapter 5. It's going to be really good. There is the obvious imagery of a wedding, which is taking place. This builds on the idea already presented in 19:7. So if you flip back to 19:7, there is this picture of Christ coming for his bride. His bride has been prepared for him, and now we have kind of the culmination or the consummation of that, however you might want to look at it. And then this voice says, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people." And God's ancient promises made in Leviticus and Ezekiel are fulfilled in this event. In Leviticus 26:11, Israel was told conditionally that if they remained obedient, God would set his tabernacle among them and would not abhor them. While in Babylon, Ezekiel prophesied that there would come a time of ultimate restoration of God's people under the terms of the new covenant, resulting in the renewal of the original privilege. My tabernacle, God says, also shall be with them. Indeed, I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And we had talked about at the very onset of this study, almost a year ago, the fact that almost every single verse in the book of Revelation has some kind of allusion or echo back to the Old Testament. That you can see John is referencing imagery from the Old Testament, quoting verses from the Old Testament all over the place, and this is one. This has been a promise, God dwelling with his people and making his tabernacle with them. You'll have all kinds of different, depending on which English translation you have, but it says, "Look, God's dwelling." Some places say his tabernacle, his abode, those types of things, but wherever he's going to live is now among people, and he had promised that long ago. It's now been realized. And then this most beautiful section, and one that I think many of us have often thought of, he says that God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain. And wide variety of ideas here. Some understand this to teach that there will be tears in heaven. So some understand this to be there will be tears in heaven, and when you're crying in heaven, God will be there to personally wipe your tears away. I mean, it says he's going to wipe away every tear, so what do we do with it? However, William Biederwolf suggests that the words simply mean that he will so constitute things that no more tears will be shed. We would say this is very plausible. This seems to be confirmed by the explanation in the very next clause The causes of present mourning and crying are eradicated forever. So God wiping away every tear is really saying more that God will wipe away all of the things that should ever cause you tears, like death and sorrow and crying and pain, that all of those things will be taken away forever, and that is what it means that he's wiping away the tears. Now, there are also some people who have suggested that and speculated that perhaps there is a moment of reckoning before the Lord that each one of us have, where if you go to like 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and it says that each one of us will appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and that is not the great white throne judgment, but that's the Bema seat judgment. We made that distinction, I think, last week. To give an account for the things done in this body, whether good or bad. And this is the believer's judgment. And believers are going to give an account for all of the things that they have done in this life, whether good or bad. The good news is that at the end of that, the verdict for every single one of us is, you did good. Not by your own efforts and not by your own merit, but by the grace of your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, you did good. And there will be reward for those things that we have done, that God has, the good works that he prepared in advance for us to do, he rewards us for them. It's wild. However, some people have suggested that there is this last moment of reckoning with our past lives, that we should look back at all of the ways that we had failed our Lord, all of the ways that we had not been good stewards of our lives, of our time, of our finances, of our words, of all of the things that he had entrusted to us, and we will stand and weep, perhaps, over our many, many failures in this life, at which point Jesus so graciously looks down and says, "They're there. No need to cry anymore." And I tend to think it might be something like that. I tend to think and almost hope sometimes that God would reveal to me the full weight of my sin that I don't even perceive right now, that I'm standing here even right now and don't even understand the magnitude of my failures before him, of the hardness of my heart, the secret little places in my heart that aren't fully surrendered over to God, that I don't even see all of these things right now. And if I were to die right now, I would never have any knowledge of them. But how gracious would it be of God to, in one final moment, just say, let me just show you exactly what it all looked like from right here. At which point you get to have this overwhelming guilt, this crushing guilt placed on you as you stand before God, not to remain there forever, but so that you can feel it for a moment, in order that when it is lifted off of you, it is fuel to worship for all of eternity. That I can really, truly worship God now, like for all that he has done for me. Because if he doesn't show me all the bad stuff, then I'll never know about the bad stuff. So I think he might show me all that bad stuff. I'll probably cry a lot. And then he'll probably comfort me. And perhaps it goes something like that. As for sorrow, grief, and pain, our relationship with God through Christ has even transformed these experiences in our current reality, so that while we do still mourn the loss of loved ones, we do not sorrow as others who have no hope. So this again kind of going back to the all things being made new, in the same way we're the already but not yet, we're living in this reality already, right? That in a certain sense, God has already wiped all the tears from our eyes, because really, there's no reason for us to mourn, because the victory's already won. And even at the loss of a loved one, we know we're going to see them again. They're not gone forever. Just taking a little break. taking a little break in between visits, and we'll be reunited soon. The old order of things has passed away, he says, and I'm making all things new. Sort of a repetition of the earlier declaration that he made. The world order as we know it, the influence of sin and rebellion toward God will be done away with. And this is the ultimate reality of the work of the cross. So there is essentially what Jesus did. This again, the already not yet what Jesus accomplished on the cross will be brought into true and complete perfection when the old order of things, when the sinful nature is completely done away with. And all of those who have remained enslaved to their sinful nature and who had followed after the deceiver will all be separated over to this one side, the sheep and the goats. Jesus says, I'm going to put all the goats over here, and they'll all be over there, and I'm going to put all the sheep over here. And that old order of things will all be over there, and we're going to move forward into eternity with a new order, with a new way of life, and he will make all things new. And this also applies to Christians now. Old things have passed away, behold, all things have become new. Again, that pertains here, just as it did previously. And with the emphasis upon all things, he points out that the Christian is not simply given a ticket to heaven and a new set of religious rituals, but every area of his life is targeted for renewal as the result of his participation in the new life. So this is the transformation that takes place in the heart of all believers, the one that we must continually yield ourselves to day after day, moment after moment, that we must give into the newness that God is trying to create inside of all of us, that we might be these new beings, not the ones still giving ourselves over to the sinful desires of the flesh, but walking in the newness of life. That is a present reality for us that we can live in. It's a struggle. When we get to heaven, the struggle's over, and we will live in that reality in ease and freedom. And then he says, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And as Jesus declared upon the cross, it is finished, it is done, in John 19:30, and upon the fall of Babylon the Great, a loud voice from the temple cried, it is done. We saw that in Revelation 16:17. So now, with reference to the perfecting of the bride and the completion of God's purposes in history, it is again affirmed that it is done. So Jesus, of course, on the cross, when he said that it is finished, we always understand it is finished when we hear it to mean that the work of Jesus was finished, that what Jesus was saying is, my work is done, and that is true. His work was done. He died, and the rest of it was easy peasy. Lay down for a few days, and then get back up after a nice little nap. A little dirt nap, as they call it, except it's actually true for Jesus. And then he got back up. But him saying it is done is not only a reference to his work being done, but it is, of course, also a reference to our work being done. That our work was done when Jesus died. That there is no more striving required from us. There is nothing else required from us. It is all-encompassing. When he says it is finished, it means everything. Everything is done. My work is done. Your work is done. All of the work is done. We can rest in the grace and peace and forgiveness of God. And this, of course, the ultimate, again, reality and fulfillment about that. And everything has its beginning and end in Christ. That, of course, alluded to when he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Most everybody understands those to be the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. He's, of course, writing to a Greek-speaking audience. This is why he uses Alpha and Omega and not the Beit and the Tav of the Hebrew, or the Aleph and the Tav, rather, I'm sorry. of the Hebrew, but he uses the Alpha and Omega. And that is that everything has its beginning and end in Christ. This from Romans, that doxology in Romans chapter 11. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord so as to be his counselor? Or who has ever given to God that God should repay them? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. That everything comes from God, is sustained by him, and then goes back to him at the end of time. That everything is from God and then back to God, and this is what he's saying here. It's done, and it all started with me, and now it's all finally come back to me. Everything has come back to Jesus. To those, he says, who are thirsty, I will give water from the spring of life. Those who are victorious will inherit this and be called my children. And this is clearly the same promise as that made twice by Jesus in John's gospel, there in John 4:10 and 14, and then in chapter 7 and verse 37. And this is when he's talking about, he says, anyone who believes in me and who drinks the living water that I offer them, he says, streams of living water will flow from them. And he says this, does Jesus, in John's gospel. And then, of course, this is John setting the stage and building up to Jesus' crucifixion. When Jesus is crucified, and when he dies, he expires, and they say, go break all of their legs, and they come to Jesus, and they say, he's dead already. They don't break his legs, fulfilling prophecy. Instead, they take the spear, and they thrust it into his side. John's gospel, the only one who mentions this detail, and then he talks, of course, about the fact that from that wound in his side, blood and water flowed. And this is what Jesus had said previously. He said that if you believe in me, if you trust in me, streams of living water will flow from you. And you have an actual stream of life-giving water flowing from Jesus in his death. That his death is offering life to all those who believe. And it's actually pictured in this living water. And John, of course, as the author of the book of Revelation, drawing on much of this same sort of imagery here. There are several scholars who believe that the Gospel of John and Revelation ought to be read together, that they're companion books. They're separated by all of the other books just because of the ordering of the Bible, but in the same way, if you're not familiar, Luke and Acts are also usually seen as one literary work in two parts. That you have in Luke the life and ministry of Jesus, and then in Acts, which is also written by Luke, it is the life and ministry of the disciples, and that those should be read in tandem. A lot of people believe that John and Revelation, the Gospel of John and Revelation, also ought to be read together, and you have this kind of earthly perspective of Jesus, and then this heavenly perspective of Jesus. So anyway, almost certainly alluding to that, the phrase, he who overcomes there in verse 7 is characteristic of the phraseology in the promises made by Christ in the letters to the 7 churches at the very beginning. We saw this, the one who is victorious, or he who overcomes, and he says this kind of at the close of each one of those letters to the 7 churches. Stay faithful, stay strong, and the one who's faithful, the one who endures, the one who overcomes will be rewarded. And there's a different reward for each one of these. Some it's a crown, some it's a stone, some it's, that's right. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head right now. But there are rewards for all of the overcomers. And we see this being mentioned here again, that there is for those who overcome, and the reward is an inheritance. And the inheritance is of all things. That inheritance of all things is the natural consequence of the other part of the statement, that they shall become my children. And we, of course, see this in Romans chapter 8. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his suffering, in order that we may also share in his glory. And this is what he's saying here. This is what Jesus is saying at the end of this. The one who suffered, the one who endured, has become a son, has become a child of God. And if you're a child of God, you're just like Jesus, and you get all the stuff that Jesus gets. Your inheritance is the same inheritance as Jesus, which is all of heaven. It's all yours. This is what's pictured in the parable of the prodigal son, the lost son, that he goes and he leaves and he squanders his inheritance, and then he comes back, and then the father gives him more on top of what he had already squandered. But then kind of really the main thrust of that whole parable is about the older brother. And then he goes out to talk to the older brother, the father does, and he goes out into the field and he says, come in and celebrate with us. And the older son starts scolding his father. And he says, all these years I've been slaving for you. And you never gave me anything. And then the father says to him, son, I've always been here. And you've always been here. All that I have is yours. Everything that belongs to me belongs to you. And this is the relationship between a father and their children. And this is God's relationship with us, that everything he has is ours. And when we are his children, when we enter into eternity, that whole place is ours. You get to walk around like you own the place because you do. I will go wherever I want to, I think. I think I'll walk right over here to this area. Even, as we had talked about, even maybe right up to the very throne of God. And just sit there on Dad's lap. I think I'd like to sit on the throne with my father today. Do you think he would deny you? Do you think your dad would deny you? If I was a king and I had a throne and Simon came running up and he said, pick me up, Dad, I'd say, yes, sir. Get on up here, buddy. You know what? Try it out yourself for a minute. Why don't you just sit there? I'll take a picture.
Yeah, there would be a big line.
Yeah.
Big line of pictures left.
And then there's this blessing for the overcomer, and then that's followed. This whole section actually closes out with this curse for the non-overcomers, the ones that don't overcome. They are called the cowardly. And the cowardly are in contrast to those who have been faithful unto death. Thus, the cowardly are equated with apostates who defect from the gospel rather than enduring hardship as good soldiers of Jesus Christ. So, cowardly are being held in contrast with the faithful. And of course, in order to be faithful, it means that there is a certain amount of bravery, I guess, that must take place, boldness, where we stand up in the face of persecution, where we do not shrink away and we proclaim the name of Jesus. And of course, for John's immediate audience, this was a very real reality for them. For Christians in the first century in the Greco-Roman world, if you were out preaching Jesus, you were expecting to get yanked up by the neck and crucified or burned alive or fed to lions. That's just what you were expecting. And he says, for those faithful ones who have endured, there's a boldness. But for the ones who didn't, the cowards, something else awaits them. And they're also equated with being unbelieving and abominable and murderers and sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars. They have an inheritance as well, just as we believers have an inheritance in God, so the unbelievers have an inheritance. And as the tribes of Israel each obtained a portion of the land of Canaan, these unfaithful cowards shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. And the identification of the lake of fire with the second death is repeated, having been made first in Revelation 20:14. So there are these parallels. There's an inheritance for the sons of God, and there's an inheritance for the enemies of God. that God apportioned land to his people, to his children. He sectioned it off and gave each one sections of the land. And in the same way, he apportions parts of the lake of fire to those. This part's especially for you. And this part especially for you. And there is some solace that comes in the fact that you would think of hell as having regions, the Dante's Inferno sort of method of the 7 layers of hell. And I think that there's some kind of truth to that, whereas the punishment fits the crime, that not everyone is guilty of, while the only sin that sends anyone to hell is their rejection of Jesus. That's the sin that damns everyone. You can say it that way, Janice. That's the only sin that sends anyone to hell, is rejecting Jesus. But after you've been sent there, you're also reckoning with all of the other sins that took place in your life that have not been forgiven. And in that way, hell is sort of tailor-made for each individual, because I believe the biggest pain of hell is regret. That, like, the worst part of hell is being there, separated from the goodness of God, and knowing, I had a chance to avoid this, and I did not do it. And now instead I'm plagued by the memory and the thought of all of the wickedness and all of the sin and all of the selfishness. And that won't be the same sorts of things for everyone. Anyhow, just a brief little theology of hell. But this is the interesting part that I had mentioned at the beginning to close us out here tonight. And you can see here this little chart. And what we covered today, verses 1 to 8, and there is a parallel with the whole rest of the book here, with the remainder. So, talked about the New Jerusalem in verse 2. When we pick it back up again, it's going to be talking about the New Jerusalem in detail. And then we went on to God dwelling among us. There's going to be more explicit description of God dwelling among us there. And then the renewal of the world, and an even clearer picture of that. And then the words of the faithful and true will get repeated again. And the Alpha and Omega will get repeated again. A final blessing to all peoples that we just saw and read, and we'll see that again. And then a final curse. And that will show up again. So this, when we said this was an overview, that's essentially what it is. It's like John kind of says it all in short, and then he's going to go back and he's going to expound one point at a time on all of these things. So we will spend next week getting through the rest of 21, and then the week after that we will probably do 22 verses 1 to 15, and then there are actually some verses after that. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't end with a curse. So there's a few verses after that which are really, really beautiful, and we'll finish that out in the weeks after. So there you have it. That's, if you like to do any cross-referencing, we'll put this up again at the beginning of next week, and you can make those notes. But let me pray, and we'll get out of here. God, thank you for your love and your care for us, God. Thank you that you have planned everything, God, in this life, in our lives, in this world, throughout the course of human history, God, and even up into and through eternity, God, that you know the beginning from the end, because you are the beginning and the end. And we rest in that today, God. We pray that you would make us, by your Spirit, God, to be bold. We pray that we would live in the victory that you have already accomplished for us. We pray, God, that we would give our lives for you, and whether that means just in a kind of metaphorical sense, God, that we would live our lives and surrender to you, or whether that means that something crazy happens here in this country, and we actually find ourselves facing the same sorts of situations that have faced our brothers and sisters in the faith throughout all of time, God. May we all be found never shrinking away from our testimonies, never shrinking away from the gospel, and never shrinking away from you, God. We look forward to the day when we will see you face to face God, and you'll wipe our tears, and we'll sit on your lap, and it'll just be the most incredible time. But in the meantime, God, encourage your children. Strengthen them by your Spirit, God. Give us hope, God. Give us peace. Give us strength and love, God. Go before us and behind us. We ask in your name. And all God's children said,